here to talk with you today about an introduction to OpenTelemetry with Python. How many people have heard of OpenTelemetry? Show of hands. OK, cool. Well, I'm here to break it down, because I found it confusing when I first got started. So I'm Jessica. I'm at Jessica Garson, most places on the internet. Jessica Garson at macaw.social, if that's your jam on Mastodon. And I am a senior developer advocate at Elastic. And can everybody hear me OK? Cool. Awesome. Yeah, so all of my code, slides, everything I'll be showing today can be found on my GitHub. So feel free to follow along. I made some last-minute changes to the slides, so I'll probably update that later today. But be sure to take a look at that. Again, that's github.com, Jessica Garson, Introduction to OpenTelemetry with Python. And so I'll be breaking down kind of everything that I learned along the way. So when I first got started with OpenTelemetry, I had just started my job with Elastic. And I had taken some time off. I took a year off. I used to work at Twitter. And then after everything happened, I was like, I need a break. Came back. And I was like, what is OpenTelemetry? Everyone's talking about it. I don't know what it is. And I had attempted to find a short primer on getting started with OpenTelemetry with Python. And I really couldn't find much more than just a demo application. And it was actually a pretty cool demo application. Now that I have know some things, I'm like, OK, cool. I understand it. It's actually a really good demo. But it was a little bit over my head. I don't know if anybody else here has had that experience where you go to find a resource and you're like, I kind of get what's happening, but I kind of don't. And I don't know, why are things printing out of my console? What is happening? Why aren't I running my application? What? OK, cool. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to start with some observability basics, just because I'm a bit newer to the observability space, and I learned a lot of stuff along the way, and I want to share that. Then I'm going to give kind of a breakdown of what OpenTelemetry is and why I use it. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about Django and Flask instrumentation. And then I'll talk a little bit about the state of OpenTelemetry in general and have some conclusions and next steps. So one of the first things I did was I tried to ask ChatGPT. Because I was like, OK, I don't really, I found that demo application. And I was like, maybe I'll ask ChatGPT. ChatGPT is super friendly. I asked it to explain OpenTelemetry to me like I was 5. And I think it kind of fixated on the 5-year-old part, because it told me that OpenTelemetry is like having a magical friend who watches you draw. And the friend will take notes on what crayons that you use, how they perform, and if they break. And if something goes wrong, your magical friend will tell you exactly why your crayon broke and why. And I don't really know why crayons break. I don't really feel like if I was a 5-year-old, it would be helpful to know why crayons broke. So that didn't really help me too much. And so really, I'm hoping that you walk away from today's talk with a strong understanding of what OpenTelemetry is, kind of breaking down some of the jargon that you hear around observability, and also feeling like you're confident and ready to start integrating it into your applications. How many people here use Python? Cool. OK, awesome. So a lot of you all will be familiar. Pretty much everything I'll be talking about is applicable for other languages, too. And I'll show you kind of where to find resources for other languages as well. So we're going to start off with some observability fundamentals. So observability, the way that I like to think about it is it helps you determine what is happening inside your system by analyzing the data that it outputs. So my favorite way to think about this is kind of like how I think about being a kitty mom. So how many people, and just feel free to yell it out, know what's going on with this cat? Yeah, what's going on? What's happening? It's yawning. That's what I hear a lot. Looking adorable. That's absolutely true. What else? Anybody have any other guesses? Cleaning itself? That's a great guess. I actually thought it was getting its belly rubbed. But yeah, so just like this cat, we can actually start to think about, OK, so this cat is telling us something. And we don't exactly know what, but it's giving us hints as to what's happening. And this is kind of how I think about observability, is that your system gives you hints as to what's happening in the inside by giving you warning messages, error messages, stack errors, logs, metrics. And those all act as a hint as to what's happening. So my kitty, she's amazing. She will literally meow at the water fountain if she wants water. She sometimes will try to open up a window, which I think is the most adorable thing in the entire world, because she has these tiny kitty hands, and she's trying to open a window that I sometimes struggle with, a fully grown adult, and that means that she wants more fresh air. So she's really communicative, and I also feel like our systems are sort of the same way, where they tell you things and they tell you what's happening, just like my kitty tries to open up the window. Your system might give you logs that you think of as just oh, that error is fine, but maybe that might cause an issue later on. So really, observability is what isn't happening as expected, but also what might be going wrong. It might be OK, but might gives you kind of a pathway of what to look like or to look for later on. And I think of it more as also going beyond just detecting problems. It's really just about kind of trying to figure out what is happening, why it's happening, and also, it's also about the state that you are in, but really kind of going to that next level, being why are we in the state? What is happening? What's going on under the hood? And good observability helps you detect problems and, in some cases, prevent them. So I wanted to kind of demystify some jargon that I heard around observability. So can anybody tell me what an observability agent is? Cool. No one is responding, which is great, which means that I am going to be talking about the right things. So an observability agent is something that I heard talked about all the time, and I was like, wait, what? And I had been using observability agents, but didn't know what it was. So an observability agent is a software component or a tool that collects, processes, and sends telemetry data. And telemetry data is really just metrics, logs, and traces, and we'll talk about that in a second, coming from a system or application or to an observability platform for analysis. So what is OpenTelemetry? Can anybody tell me that? Cool. All right, I love this. I get to do all the talking. So OpenTelemetry is an observability framework that is open source and vendor neutral. It is designed to work with any backend system. And it also provides a standardized set of APIs, libraries, and tools to collect telemetry data such as metrics, logs, and traces. And OpenTelemetry enables comprehensive monitoring across many services and platforms. So why? Why use this? Why do it? So one of the things I like to think about is that logs alone are simply not enough sometimes. So how many people have tried to go into an application where you didn't know what was going on and you tried to look at the logs to figure that out? Cool. I've had that experience too. And I was looking at my own logs the other day, and I noticed something wild. So if I knew nothing about this application that clearly uses a NASA endpoint, I would probably think that I was trying to build a spaceship or something, which is not what I was doing. I was looking for weather data and looking for when asteroids were coming close to Earth. But if I didn't know, I would have made a lot of assumptions about what is happening. And I think that's one of the things that I've kind of struggled with is sometimes it's hard to determine what logs are trying to tell you. I've also had issues with debuggers in that way where I'm I really don't know what's happening or why this is happening. And so really OpenTelemetry tries to kind of go beyond that and sort of add in some enhanced visibility into the execution flow of what's happening in your application and call timing. Provide you some metrics on how users utilize services to pinpoint unnecessary ones. And also, it has the ability to detect patterns such as peak usage times, and that aids in production planning and scaling. And OpenTelemetry started as a merger of two different competing protocols happening around the same time. So there was open tracing, which is what's known as OT, which is why everybody who talks about OpenTelemetry calls it OTel, because OT already exists in the same namespace. And then there was Open Census. And so that was why I didn't really know about OpenTelemetry when I was like, wait, what? What is that? And it was because there was just so much happening within the same namespace. So it was a merger of two competing protocols that happened in 2019. And so one of the things that I find really cool about this is that we work most of the time as software engineers in the modern world with complex interconnected systems. There are so many microservices. There's so many different moving parts. And so one of the things that I like about it is that it's hard to kind of see, especially if you're working with a lot of components and a lot of different pieces, it's hard to kind of see what's happening. And so OpenTelemetry really helps you kind of figure out how the pieces fit together. And it's really awesome because everything is complicated, but it gives you one kind of way to monitor everything. And that kind of gets into this one thing I think is really cool, is that it's designed to be future-proof. So has anybody used a piece of software where you're like, oh my god, I'm going to use it forever? And then years later, it's no longer in existence. Does anybody want to shout out some of the software that you've enjoyed using? Friendster, that's a great one. Anything else? Flash, that's a good one. I was thinking of fog bugs in 2011. I was working support, and I thought that was going to be the bug tracker forever. I really liked it. That is no longer in existence. And so the idea of OpenTelemetry is that as new things change, as systems change, everyone's going to be using the same language, and that everybody will be using the same sort of observability framework to communicate with each other. And so there's this idea of future-proofing yourself, which I think is particularly cool. So that's one of, I think, the key points of it as well. So we talked a little bit about metrics, logs, and traces, and I realized that I didn't define that for you properly, so I'm going to do that. So logs are records of events in a system, troubleshooting activities. They document kind of errors, and they aid in troubleshooting and monitoring and compliance. They're really anything that has a timestamp. So for most of us, a log was our first program that we ever wrote. Basically, we logged to the computer, hello world, we're here. That is a log at the end of the day. Metrics are numbers and aggregations. They are a quantitative measurement that tracks the performance and health of a system. And then also, traces. And traces track the path and interactions of a request through a system. So one of the things that really tripped me up when I was first getting started with OpenTelemetry is that there is this concept of spans within traces. And I was like, what? What is that? I don't understand. So I wanted to break it down for you. And so the way that I kind of think about it is that a trace is like one giant operation. So getting back to my cat, every morning at about 3 a.m., I hear this loud squeal that's like, ee! And I'm like, okay, I know what time it is. And my cat will come, run as fast as she can with her little toy sloth and get me to try to play with her. And to get back to that entire operation, that is a span. But each moment of that is a trace. That entire operation is a trace, and each moment of that is a span. And so basically, at the end of the day, spans are the building blocks of traces. So they include the following information: name, parent, span ID, which is empty for root spans. And root spans are the first span. And I was so confused by this because spans are part of traces, and a span is a member of a family, and a trace is a family. And this took me so long to get until I saw it printing out of my console, and I was like, oh my god, I get it. Okay, cool, a span within a trace, I get it. And I have this very simple to-do list application that you're gonna see a lot. And it's a super simple application, and watching it come in and be like, oh, okay, I'm adding a new to-do list item. Okay, I see what's happening. That was enough to kind of get me started and being like, okay, I get it. Spans within traces. Okay, cool. So that was something that tripped me up. And you might have been like, hey, Jess, what was that picture that you just showed? So that is what the output of an instrumented app. And instrumenting refers to the process of adding observability features to your application to collect telemetry data such as traces, metrics, and logs. And I'm going to be talking about two Python programming languages, or web frameworks rather, Django and Flask. Anybody here has used Django or Flask? Okay, cool. Anybody use a different Python web framework? OK, cool. I picked the 2 right ones. This should look very similar if you're used to something different as well, too. So let's talk about the classic Django example. I love the to-do list application for demo apps. How many people here have built a to-do list application before? It's typically like the first thing that you build when you're learning web programming, and I love it. I think it's a really great way to kind of show what's going on. So you might have been like, OK, so really, you said you were going to explain how you got that data to show in your console earlier. Like, how did you do that? And so the first thing is that I would want to download the required packages. So for this, since this is a Django example, I would do pip install Django, Django environ, Elastic OpenTelemetry, which is a wrapper of the OpenTelemetry distro, so you could use either one or the other. I work at Elastic, so I figured I would use that one. OpenTelemetry instrumentation, Django, which is the Django-specific instrumentation. And then from there, I can use this extra bootstrapping command that will install some required packages to get my app up and running. And really, that one, the screenshot that I showed earlier, that was the result of the manage.py changes that are here. And where it says console span exporter, that says, hey, can you print out all of the things that are happening to your application inside your console? And so that is how I got that to work. And then, so there is another type of instrumentation that is referred to as automatic instrumentation as well. And so automatic instrumentation is the process by which an agent modifies the bytecode of your application, often to insert monitoring code. And really, when I think about what automatic instrumentation is, it is really just, OK, cool. I don't want to write anything. Can you just handle all of the observability for me so I can just do it? Cool. OK, thanks. Awesome. And that's kind of the way to think about what automatic instrumentation is. And so to get that set up, what you'd want to do is you want to create a .env example file, or a .env file. I created an example file, but you would create just a .env file. And so from here, you have this OTel exporter, and that is kind of your authorization key. And then from there, you're going to have your endpoint, which is going to be your host endpoint. I use Elastic Cloud, so it would be my Elastic Cloud endpoint, and that's what I would set up my .env file with. And then my manage.py file would look something like this. And there's one piece of code that I want you to look at, which is this Django instrumentator .instrument, and that's where the automatic instrumentation takes place, because you're like, hey, please instrument my code. Thanks. Awesome. And that's kind of really what enables automatic instrumentation. And then you want to just update your settings .py file to read in your environment variables, and it should be pretty simple from there. And then in your server, you would just do manage.py run server, and then your to-do list application would appear. And then if you go into Elastic, or whatever backend provider you choose to use for your observability, you could see the services, which is to-do list app, listed. And then you can kind of see everything where all of the different calls that you made in your application, the transactions, the throughput, any failures or errors, you can kind of see that as well. So I've had some I used to be very big into live demos, but I had some recent issues. So this is my first time ever actually using a video. So we're going to see how that goes. So the first thing that you would do is you would want to type in Python manage.py run server. And then from here, you would kind of see it all kind of be ready to go in localhost 8000. And that is kind of just like the standard Django app. And then from here, you can see the to-do list. You would go, and you would add a to-do list item. So it would just be like new item, cool. And then from there, you'd just be like, yay, a new task. And then you would add that. And you could add another one. This one is going to be called second list item. And then from here, you'd be like, cool, giving a talk. That's fun. And then after, what it's going to show is going to be the services, and then I'm deleting the task just to kind of show that. And sometimes there is a lag between the time that you do the thing to when it shows up in your observability provider. And that can differ depending on what observability provider that you're using. So we see this to-do list app listed. And then from there, I'm going to click it. Watching myself as a recording is a fun experience. This is my first time doing that in a talk. And then we can see all of those transactions that we talked about. And those are all mapped to the transactions that I made. So that's a little bit about how that works, just to kind of show you. Manual instrumentation is sort of the opposite. So instead of saying, like, hey, OpenTelemetry, do all of this for me, manual instrumentation requires incorporating particular code segments into your application to collect and transmit telemetry data. So you might be wondering, when would you want to use manual instrumentation if you could just have the computer do it for you, right? Anybody know why? Any guesses? I mean, that is possible. It could very well be a data pipeline that OpenTelemetry doesn't get access to. You might have configurations that you're looking at. You might have a spidey sense that something is up with a part of your code that you want to instrument more deeply than another part. You might have other data or systems that you want to pinpoint. The way that I like to think about it is, for automatic instrumentation, it's so awesome if you have, I make a lot of demo apps. I speak at a lot of conferences, such as this one. So for me, I used to think that adding observability data would just take too much time. And now I'm like, oh, actually, it's like a couple of lines of code, and I'm good to go. I don't have to do much more. And that's great for my purposes. However, if I was working on more robust software, or if I was working with a lot of microservices, I might want to customize things. If I'm more of an engineer, if I'm spending more time in the code, if I have a specific reason, then I would want to use manual. So the way that I think about it is, for custom code configurations, for SREs, you might want to do manual. But if you really just want to instrument an old code base, or you really just want to get something up and running, you could do that with automatic instrumentation pretty quickly. So to use manual instrumentation, the first thing that you're going to want to do in Django is you're going to want to delete that one line of code that's hey, Django, please instrument my code. You do not want that. That will cause issues. So that's going to be the first thing that you're going to want to delete. It's shown as commented out here, but really just delete it if you're looking to that. And then from there, you can update your views.py file. This one creates some custom metrics, so it will count the number of requests that are viewed. It will also view a histogram, which will measure the duration of view execution, which could be really helpful. And then from here, you'd also want to set some custom spans inside of your index, which is kind of cool. And then you can also add that in there as well. You could do something similar for deleting as well, and this just has some custom spans that are added as well too. And one thing that I think is important to note here is that you can also do a hybrid approach, which I've seen a couple of times, because you can customize some of the automatic spans as well, which is also sometimes super helpful. And then after you've kind of customized everything to your liking, from there you just want to update your models.py file just to make sure that as you're making changes to the data model, that's reflected within all of your custom spans and metrics. And then you would do Python manage.py run server, and then we have the to-do list application up and running, and you can kind of see everything. But before we do that, I couldn't help myself but to do a live demo. So I made the applications look a little bit different, just so I don't get confused. This one's the Django one. And then from here, let's just say bits. And then we can say hi. And then let's delete a couple, just for good measure. And then hi again. And then from here, inside of Elastic, just to kind of show, hopefully the Django one shows. live demos, cool, it's working. This is to-do list manual, and then we can kind of see it, and if we wanted to click on kind of adding the view and everything like that, then we have that up and running. So that's something that I find really helpful as well. So yay, cool. Let's get back into the slides. So you might be wondering, how does this work with Flask? Is it different or the same? How many people think it's going to be exactly the same? OK, nobody thinks it's going to be exactly the same, because why would I talk about it? That makes sense. Cool. So Flask. How many people here have used Flask before? Cool. One of the things I find to be one of the most exciting things I've seen in software engineering in a long time is that you don't have to make any code changes to use automatic instrumentation, which is wild to me. So you don't even have to add a single line of code. It's just how you run the code, which I found to be really crazy. And also, I've not instrumented my code, including Flask demo apps, many, many times, because I was like, oh, this would be too hard. I can't do that. I don't have time. And it turns out that I didn't even have to change any code, which is pretty wild and one of the coolest things. And the reason why that happens is through a trick within the Python path where they add in observability features in Flask, which I think is pretty cool. So all you have to do is pip install an OpenTelemetry distro. I'm using the Elastic version. Again, I work at Elastic, so that is just how I do it. And then from there, I can do the OpenTelemetry bootstrap, and that action will install all the required packages. And then from here, because I did .env last time, I figured I would show you just how to set some environment variables. So the service name is what I want to appear when I'm looking in Elastic, when I'm like, OK, cool. And one thing that's important to note is that you can use Elastic, but you could really use any observability provider of your choosing. And we'll talk about that at the end as well. And then from there, you could kind of put in your authorization headers. That's my API key for my service that I'm using. And then from there, the OTel exporter is going to be my Elastic Cloud URL for me. And then from there, all I have to do is OpenTelemetry instrument Flask run. And then you see the to-do list. And then you can kind of see that listed. And then from here, you could kind of see everything kind of in there, which I thought was really cool. And I think that was one of the things for me that I was like, OK, all right, awesome. And then I have that actually running right now. So we can actually kind of say, hi friends. And then let's actually delete a couple things. And now if we go in to services, and we actually can see that my Flask to-do app is still running. We see all the posts and the add and the get and everything like that. And then from here, we actually can kind of see everything kind of just in here, which is really cool. And one of the things that's really cool is that there's no code changes. So if I wanted to take a look at what the Flask app.py or app. Yeah, cool. I had it the first time. Cool. So if I want to take a look at this, as you can see, it's just your basic Flask to-do list application. I have all the HTML and CSS all in line. Sorry to any designers that are in the room or front-end people. And it's just your most basic app. And there's nothing that I need to do other than just run that OpenTelemetry instrument line of code, which I thought was incredibly exciting, because I don't know about you, but sometimes when things just work, it's really exciting, because I spend a lot of time debugging and trying to find the right answer. So sometimes, every so often in software engineering, you have a moment where you're like, oh my god, that just does the thing. That's magic. And that's kind of, I don't know, the feeling that I chase. And the reason I'm here talking to you about this was that one moment where I was like, oh my god, this is so cool. And there are so many apps that I didn't instrument because I thought it would be too hard to. And just to find out that oh, it's actually one line of code. So let's talk a little bit about manual instrumentation in Flask, because that is obviously a little bit harder. So instead of running it with that OpenTelemetry command, you actually just want to run it like you would run any Flask application, because you're going to set up all of the backend and everything for that. So you would just do Flask run p-5000. And then let's actually just take a look at the code. I always like talking through the code. So let me just make this a bit Cool. Sorry about that. I needed to make it a bit bigger just so that you all could see it. Can everybody see this okay? So there's a lot of imports. There might be a better way to reduce some of the import statements, but I tried to combine some things and it didn't quite work as well. But the first thing that we'd want to do is just get our environment variables. And then from here, we're just going to be like, cool, if there's no OTLP endpoint, that's kind of the main observability endpoint, or the proper authentication headers, let me know. And then from here, I put everything into a dictionary and do some splitting. And then from here, I have my service name. That's what appears in the service in Elastic. And then I have this tracer provider as well. And let me turn off Grammarly. That's fun. Cool. So yeah, no. Cool. Great. Awesome. And then we have this OTLP trace exporter, which is basically where I'm like, hey, can you send this to an observability backend? And then from here, I have the spam processor and the tracer. That's where we can kind of send all of our custom spans and traces to our observability provider. So from here, we create a tracer. And then we want to kind of configure our custom metrics. And then we want to set up a metrics reader and a metrics provider. And then from here, we can create a meter, which is like a counter, which will tell you how many requests have been received. And then from here, I just want to basically start my Flask app just like I typically would, start up my SQLite database, initialize everything. And then from here, you can actually just kind of get everything into a database. And then from here, this is my very ugly HTML template with inline CSS. Sorry, front-end web people. And then from here, I just have my very classic routes for getting, adding, and deleting. And so this is a very simple application, but it's a little bit more complicated because I had to add in my observability code. And that's one of the things I think is really cool about the Flask implementation is that you either don't have to add any code in or you can add your own. And that is, I actually think, a really cool paradigm. Cool. So I talked a little bit about this already. But let me show you a video. Actually, you saw me do it. You don't have to. Or actually, we could do a video. So basically, from here, I just run everything as is. It should be, and this is in my terminal as well. And then from here, I'm typing hi. I don't know. I never know what to type for these. So the exercise of building this app was a lot of me typing hi and hello into a to-do list application. And then from there, I'll just delete them. And then you can actually see that here. And then you can actually see all of my information shown. And this is the manual instrumentation version of Flask. Also keep in mind that this can take up to a minute or two, sometimes 5 minutes, depending on if you have slow internet. So I one time tried to do this demo, and I was in a room full of people just like you all. And I was like, oh, wow, OK, nothing's working. And then I finally went on with my talk and was like, OK, cool. So there's another way that you can actually do this that's different. Which is an OpenTelemetry collector. So instead of using Flask or Django or any application of your choosing, you can actually just do this with an OpenTelemetry collector. So this is a solution for retrieving, processing, and exporting telemetry data. And this is great for if you're using lots of different software or you're using a complicated code base. It's really great, and it kind of eliminates the need to manage multiple clients or collectors. And so I like the OpenTelemetry demo. I think it's super cool. We have actually an Elastic fork of it, but it provides lots of different microservices. It's just a more realistic way of kind of showcasing how this would work in a more realistic environment. And so I took a video because I had lots of live demos for this. So for this is the OpenTelemetry Elastic fork of the OpenTelemetry demo. And from here, I just cloned it. And so I would just copy that and type that in, and then do just a git clone in my terminal. And then that kind of would allow me to kind of grab that in my local environment. And then from there, I can grab my keys and tokens that I would need. So from here, I'm going to go into our EPM area and click under where it says integrations, and then click where it says APM. And then from there, what I would do is I would grab my keys and tokens from where it says OpenTelemetry all at the bottom, which gives me all of the endpoint that I was using and the API key. And so that was really helpful for me in terms of just grabbing that and getting all my keys and tokens. And then the collector is really just a YAML file. So I took this YAML file from the directions in the repository. And then from there, I was able to kind of just put in my endpoint and my secret. And then from there, and just authenticate. And it was really simple. And there are, the exporters and the services and the pipelines. And this is basically the directions for kind of compiling everything. And this runs many, many services. And I ran it using Docker, which allowed me to kind of have this environment that was like up and running. And you'll see that in a second. But from here, all I type in is make start. And then after that, a bunch of services will start running. So I'm like, OK, cool. Let's make this file. And this is using Docker. I use Docker Desktop, which I find to be pretty robust. And then from here, it's like, OK, cool. Docker is composing this env file. And then as you can see, everything's kind of showing up here. And it creates a bunch of different services. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with like, instead of just using one, you can actually use many different services. And this is the language that many observability providers are kind of moving more towards. And so it's like, OK, cool. The OpenTelemetry is up and running. You can see other services running as well. And you can actually kind of go. So if I wanted to click on this 8080 port, this will kind of upload kind of a front end. It's a telescope store. Which is kind of cute. And if you click go shopping, there's actually some cute telescopes available as well. And then what I think is really cool is inside of Elastic, all of the services that I started earlier will just show. And this more realistic environment that I kind of wanted to show you as well as we kind of think through what this looks like. So from here, you can actually see that I have 19 services running instead of the 2 or 3. And when we look at the services, we can actually see the front end proxy, all of these services, the load generator, all of these things that we would typically see in a more realistic software environment instead of just like a simple to-do list application. So I wanted to kind of give you a preview of what this looks like in a more realistic environment. Cool. So you might be wondering, so what are, you just showed 3 different ways to do this and 2 different Python web frameworks. What's the difference? What are the pros and cons of each approach? What do I use when, why? Automatic instrumentation is great to just get up and running. If you want to add observability features to your application in an open source way, this is one way to do it, and you can do it really easily. And I found, especially with the no-code way of doing it in Flask, that was really awesome. And Django isn't that hard either. Once you get the hang of it, it's like, OK, cool. I have this up and running. It's an interesting way of doing it. The collector is really great if you have lots of different things. So I found that to be really great. One thing that's important to note is that with PHP in particular, you can't do automatic instrumentation due to some language constraints. And so this kind of gets me to something I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, which is that it's kind of like a work in progress. And so what I found is that it keeps getting better all the time. And so my con for everything is that I started working closely with OpenTelemetry in about March of this year. And I think it's October, right? I think it's almost Halloween. Yeah, OK, cool. So it's October now. And I feel like it's gotten easier to work with OpenTelemetry. And somebody that I was talking to when I first started this process was like, yeah, it gets better all the time. And I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, it's just getting better. It's like a young project. So every time I go to use it, it's just easier and easier and easier. And sometimes I found that older tutorials seem really scary to me, whereas newer stuff I'm like, oh, OK, cool, I got it. And I think that's because of improvements to the language. And so my biggest con is also just the load time, depending on when services load in. Sometimes it's really quick that I could see everything in my backend observability provider, but other times it can take up to like 5 minutes, and I get really nervous if I'm showing a demo and things like that. So yeah. So I work at Elastic, so you might be wondering, like, Jess, all you showed me was Elastic. Like, how does Elastic fit into us? Do I have to use Elastic? You don't. Elastic natively supports the OpenTelemetry protocol. So this means trace data and metrics collected from your applications and infrastructure, they can be sent directly to the Elastic stack. But you can use any backend observability provider of your choosing if they support OpenTelemetry. And I really like this graph that we had, though, because it kind of broke it down about when to use the collector versus when to use telemetry, or when to use language SDKs. So I showed you kind of like a more infrastructure example. For infrastructure metrics and logs, you'd want to use the Elastic collector. But then for applications, metrics, and traces, and just like basic application data, you'd want to just use the language SDKs, and you can combine them or extend it if you want. And so one of the things I've kind of touched upon a little bit is that OpenTelemetry is a work in progress. Not everything works exactly how you would think it would. It's kind of a young project that's getting better. So we're not in that dream state where every backend provider supports OpenTelemetry. Some places support some parts of it, other places support other parts of it. It's a work in progress. It is currently, some parts of it are experimental, some parts of it are more stable for some languages versus other languages. So if we take a look at this OpenTelemetry status, we can see that logging is in development for Python, which is something that's pretty cool. And it's stable for traces and metrics, which is why I didn't show as much logging, just because it's currently in development. And I think the reason why that is because of the way that OpenTelemetry was created. The wire trace protocol was set up first, and that was one of the projects that got folded in. And then the metrics comes from some of the work that Open Census was doing, as well as my understanding. And if you, please come find me if that is not 100% right. So I'm just learning this, but I was reading something about that recently. So yeah, but my understanding is because of the way that things were developed, the reason why traces and metrics are more ahead of logs is because of that reason. So I thought that that was pretty cool. And then I have a couple of closing thoughts. How am I with time? How much time do I have? OK, yeah, I'm pretty much, yeah, and then we could do Q&A. So I have a couple of closing thoughts. One, I always like to define what I'm talking about. So if nothing else, you walk away with an understanding of what OpenTelemetry is, and you're not like me, the confused kitty at the beginning of this. It's like, wait, what? What are you talking about? So if anybody comes up again, OpenTelemetry, commonly called OTel, is an open source vendor neutral framework designed to integrate with any backend system. One of the things that I found, I mean, this is just my own experience, but like, it's very easy to start instrumenting your code. And I don't know about you all, but like, there's so many things I didn't instrument that I think I could have now that I've like gone down this pathway. I'm like, oh my God, this isn't that hard. Like, okay, cool. And like, instrumenting is really important because you don't know what's going to be useful later on. Like, you don't know what's going to cause your next big outage. You don't know what's going to happen. So like, having that extra insight, I don't know anybody who's had like a live demo break on them. I've had a lot. I'm actually surprised that that did not happen today. And so like knowing why my applications are crashing or having more information about that is always helpful. So I found that really useful, which is like it's very easy to start instrumenting your code because you don't know what's going to be helpful later on. I showed some very simple configurations, but it is highly configurable and extendable. You can build your own wrappers. You can integrate this in many different ways. There is a podcast that's linked to in my GitHub that is 50 minutes as an introduction to OpenTelemetry. And then there are like 102 episode is about 65 minutes. And I was like, OK, there's like so much that you can do. And it's just highly configurable. And you can make it work for your system if needed. So I think that that's really cool. And the other thing is like the same way that I showed for my small applications is not much different from like a big, larger application. So really, it scales pretty well from both large applications to small applications. So I have a couple of next steps. One, if you want to hang out with me again, I'm going to be hanging out at Elasticon NYC, and that's going to be on November 13th. If you do use Elastic and you want to give a talk, come find me. I'm working on building the community track, so it should be really cool. So come hang out with me. Again, I'm also going to be at All Things Open and some other places coming up soon, too. Let me know if this talk inspires you to build anything. I'm Jessica Garson on most platforms, and thank you all for listening to me talk about OpenTelemetry for one of the longest talks I've given in a long time. And I think we have time for questions and answers, too. So thanks, y'all. Any questions? Yeah, that's a really good question. And this came up the other day. I'm often on the Elastic community forums trying to answer questions if I can. And there was actually a question that came up the other day where somebody wanted a different type of metric than that was available. Because you can write custom code, in theory, you could probably customize your own metrics if that's what you're looking for. But there are some available as well. And I really like the OpenTelemetry documentation. So if we do a search for metrics, let's do a search here for metrics in the OpenTelemetry documentation. We can kind of see what's available. And I find this, I really enjoyed using the documentation. I found it pretty useful and user-friendly. So you can actually kind of see what's available. So the main ones are counter, asynchronous counter, up-down counter, asynchronous up-down counter, gauge, and histogram. And I think actually the next time that I do this talk, that's a good shout. I'm probably going to add a slide with this. So thank you for that. Any other questions? Yeah, that's a great question. So you asked, is there a specific example of being able to fix something based on your experience? And I'm going to be really honest. I do a lot of live demos. I engage in an art form called live coding, which is that I make music and visual art with code, and I sample myself screaming. And so I'm very much like a live always. This is, I think, my first time I've ever used videos in it. And so I actually have a couple of demo apps. And I was like, and I had something happen recently where my demo didn't work. And I was like, oh my God, okay. I just spoke in front of 200 people and my demo crashed. Oh, cool. And I was actually able to kind of just add some instrumentation to it and try it on my own. And I think I was able to figure out why my demo crashed, just because I was getting all these warnings that I was just ignoring because it was demo code and it just had to work, but it didn't necessarily have to be maintainable in the same way. And as a developer advocate, my job is to give demos and hang out at places like this and show what's going on. And for me, being able to use instrumentation has been helpful. So I don't write as much production code these days, but I have found it helpful for my job as a developer advocate because so much of my code is running examples and things like that. Any other questions? Cool. Well, come find me. I'll be around all day. So does anybody have anything else you want to talk about? Any thoughts? Anything before we can conclude? Cool. Well, let me actually put the slides up one more time, just so that you can see that. And thank you all for listening to me talk about OpenTelemetry for about an hour. So you all are awesome. Thank you so much, and really appreciate you all.